Hello, I'm recording this. Welcome to our session. Okay, so where we're at, we went through the 10 plagues, but let's just do a little bit of a review of the book of Exodus. So the book of Exodus is the story of Israel being delivered from slavery in Egypt. The main person in the book of Exodus is Moses. And then one of the things that we started to wrestle with last month is the idea of God picking a particular people over the rest of everyone. That was something we were all kind of struggling with, is how can God choose Israel and not choose everybody else? But we're starting to see how that theme is going to start to unfold within the Bible and come into fulfillment when we get to Jesus. This is going to be a monthly occurrence, I think, so I can't wait for the new boiler here. So anyway, that's what basically that is. So we went through the call and formation of Moses. Do you remember how Moses was a murderer? Remember how Moses didn't have his stuff together, yet God chose him? Remember that? Also remember Moses versus Pharaoh and the 10 plagues. So if you remember the 10 plagues, the purpose behind the 10 plagues was for God to judge the gods of Israel, the gods of Egypt. So Egypt's gods were false, and God was going to prove it that they were false by doing those 10 plagues. Okay? So we get through all the plagues, frogs and locusts and water turning into blood, all that, And what's the common theme that starts to happen is that Moses always hardened his heart. He always hardened his heart after seeing all those signs. Until the moment, at the moment of the actual Passover, the last plague. The last plague is God striking down the firstborn of all living things in the land of Egypt. From the firstborn of the Pharaoh to the firstborn of your dog. All of the firstborn were to be killed. And that was finally to get the attention of Pharaoh. But if you remember what happened with Israel, that was the moment of the Passover. So what I want to do is kind of go over that and how it leads to the climax of the story. So if you go to Exodus, which is the second book of the Bible, go to Exodus chapter 12. Okay, chapter 12. I got an extra Bible. You guys can share that one. I always do it. Okay, chapter 12 of Exodus. So this one will be actually pretty familiar to you, this story, this part of the book. Okay, I'll read it here. Are you at chapter 12? Have you made it there? Hey, you're getting quick on finding in the Bible. What do you know? What are you, Catholic? Okay, here we go. All right, let's look at the beginning of chapter 12. So it says, "The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, 'This month shall stand at the head of your calendar. You shall reckon it the first month of the year. Tell the whole community of Israel, on the 10th day of this month, every one of your families must procure for itself a lamb, one apiece for each household. If a family is too small for a whole lamb, it shall join the nearest household in procuring one, and shall share in the lamb in proportion to the number of persons who partake of it. The lamb must be a year-old male and without blemish. You may take it either from the sheep or the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, and then with the whole assembly of Israel present, it shall be slaughtered during the evening twilight. They shall take some of its blood and apply it to the 2 doorposts and the lintel of every house in which they partake of the lamb. That same night they shall eat its roasted flesh with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. It shall not be eaten raw or boiled, but roasted whole, with its head and shanks and inner organs. None of it must be kept beyond the next morning. Whatever is left over in the morning shall be burned up. This is how you are to eat it. With your loins girt, sandals on your feet, and your staff in hand, you shall eat like those who are in flight. It is the Passover of the Lord. For on this same night I will go through Egypt, striking down every firstborn of the land, both man and beast, and executing judgment on all the gods of Egypt, I the Lord. But the blood will mark the houses where you are. Seeing the blood, I will pass over you. Thus, when I strike the land of Egypt, no destructive blow will come upon you. This day shall be a memorial feast for you, which all your generations shall celebrate with pilgrimage to the Lord as a perpetual institution. Does that sound familiar? Do you know what day we read that reading? Nope, you're close. Nope, you're close. Holy Thursday. This is the first reading of Holy Thursday Mass every year. Every year. So if you look, what's going on here is, what's going on here. What is the Passover? The Passover is Israel leaving Egypt. Do you notice? They're in a hurry. It's like wearing with your coat on and your hat on and your wallet in your back and your purse around your body. You don't take it off. You're eating like that. You're all ready, and what do? There are no leftovers. There's supposed to be no leftovers because you're never going to be in this place ever again. This is your last meal here, right? And what is sacrificed? A lamb, right? So a lamb. And if you start noticing right here, right away, you can start seeing how this is connected with our faith. What do we say before we receive Holy Communion? Behold, the Lamb of God. You see, this is where it's starting to begin here. And if you notice, this meal is to help you to remember a moment in the history of Israel. You know how it says, you shall, if you look at verse 14, this day shall be a memorial feast for you, which all your generations shall celebrate with pilgrimage to the Lord as a perpetual institution. So from this point on, no matter where the Israelites lived, in the Promised Land or away, they are to do this every year on this day, and it's supposed to mark the rest of your calendar. So if you think about that, you see the beginnings of what we're actually doing, right? You see it right there within that. So that's why the Passover is one of the highest feasts, and it's no accident that Jesus instituted what he was about to do on this very night. So this becomes the central moment of Israel right here, when they're being let go from slavery. Okay? So if you think about that, as you look at this scripture, let's just go real quick. The first 14 verses, kind of talk with one, or just briefly, what's one phrase that strikes you about this? Go back the 14 verses. What's one detail that kind of strikes you? Okay, any details that pop out to you? I always like to, it's us kind of reading the scripture slowly. What details kind of pop out? Oh, I didn't realize that. I didn't realize that was there. Maybe I named all the details. I probably should ask the question first. Any details that pop out at you? Like, why is that there?
Just the specifics of what they had to do with that lamb.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
No chance for field dressing. Because it gets to the idea of they're in a hurry. But it also brings something else, how the exactness of ritual. You see, they're describing a ritual, and a ritual has to be the same every time you do it for it to be a ritual. You know? So you're kind of getting at that, Carl, of the detail of it. Anybody else? So let me ask you this. Who were the ones that were supposed to slaughter the lambs? It's actually not in there. So Moses was of what tribe? Do you remember what tribe he was of? Remember? If you can go to the first chapter, you'll find it. He was of the tribe of Levi, the tribe of the priests. So another idea, this brings up the whole idea of priesthood. Who actually sacrifices the lambs would be the priests. So that's their job. Their job in the Old Testament was to slaughter animals. I'm glad that changed. Yeah? Okay. So let's keep on moving forward. Let's go to 14 now. Turn to chapter 14 now. Now, if you go to verse 5, go to verse 5 of 14. Here you have the Lord saying to Moses, now start going towards the Red Sea. I want you to start going towards the Red Sea, okay? Then, in verse 5, here's what happens. This is the Pharaoh now. When it was reported to the king of Egypt that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his servants changed their minds about them. What have we done? They exclaimed. Why have we released Israel from our service? So Pharaoh made his chariots ready and mustered his soldiers, 600 first-class chariots, and all the other chariots of Egypt with warriors on them all. So obstinate had the Lord made Pharaoh that he pursued the Israelites even while they were marching away in triumph. The Egyptians then pursued them, Pharaoh's whole army, his horse, chariots, and charioteers, caught up with them as they lay encamped by the sea, Pi Hahiroth, in front of Baal Zephon. I think I get that one right. Okay. So here, what you're coming to is the final judgment of God on Egypt. This is what's going to happen. Right? So you're at the Red Sea. Now let's look at the Red Sea. Pharaoh was already near the Israelites, looked up and saw the Egyptians were on the march in pursuit of them. In great fright, they cried out to the Lord, and they complained to Moses. Were there no burial places in Egypt that you had to bring us out here to die in the desert? Why did you do this to us? Why did you bring us out of Egypt? Did we not tell you this in Egypt when we said, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? Far better for us to be the slaves of the Egyptians than to die in the desert. But Moses answered the people, fear not, stand your ground, and you will see the victory of the Lord will win for you today. These Egyptians whom you see today, you will never see again. The Lord himself will fight for you. You only have to keep still. So think about that for a brief moment. Okay, you're having an army come at you, and Moses is saying, yeah, just stay still. Basically, chill out. The Lord is actually going to take care of you. How does that strike you? The Lord is going to take care of you with an army bearing down upon you, and there's a whole thing of water, and they're coming out here, and you're trapped there. Right? But let me ask you, after seeing all that went on previous in the book of Exodus, wouldn't you believe Moses? But look at the people of Israel, already out of Egypt just for 2 seconds. They're complaining. And this is a pattern that we're going to see throughout the whole Old Testament. Is that, oh, we love you, God. Why did you do this to me, God? Oh, we love you, God. Why aren't you there for me, God? Oh, you were there for me, God. Now you're not there for me. It's back and forth, God dealing with these fickle people. These fickle people. And look what happens. Moses says, keep still. Let God fight for you. Okay? So I think there's kind of a lesson there for all of us. How often do we do that? You know, God help me. That's kind of what we do, right? Okay. All right, so let's go to verse 23. Oh, so actually, to talk about, so I think we went over, did we go over this earlier in one of them? Maybe not.
Yeah,
So, yeah, you did, okay. So let me ask you this. Before you look at it, we're going to look at this miracle, okay? So this is a miracle. The crossing of the Red Sea. Tell me what happens at the crossing of the Red Sea without reading the Bible. What's in your head? You know it. Tell me.
Water part.
The water parts. How does it part? How do you think it parts?
Wind.
So you say wind, Diane? Staff? Okay. What do you think? Hand of God? Okay.
Low tide.
Low tide? All right. Let's see if your memory serves you, okay? So go to verse 15. Ready there? See it there? Verse 15. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward, and you lift up your staff, and with hand outstretched over the sea, split the sea in two, that the Israelites may pass through it on dry land." Do you see what God's saying right there? That he's going to split the sea, and when they split the sea, it's going to be like a dirt road. Just think about that for a brief moment. That's amazing. Like no vacuums or, Okay. "But I will make the Egyptians so obstinate that they will go in after them. Then I will receive glory through Pharaoh and all his army, his chariots and charioteers. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I receive glory through Pharaoh and his chariots and charioteers." So here's verse 19. The angel of God. I didn't see that in the Ten Commandments with Cecil B. DeMille. Charlton Heston, did you see an angel of God? The angel of God, who had been leading Israel's camp, now moved and went around behind them. The column of cloud also leaving the front took up its place behind them, so that it became between the camp of the Egyptians and that of Israel. But the cloud now became dark, and thus the night passed without the rival camps coming any closer together all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord swept the sea with a strong east wind throughout the night, and so turned it into dry land. When the water was thus divided, the Israelites marched into the midst of the sea on dry land, with the water like a wall to their right and to their left. Right? So at your table, what surprises you about this miracle? Does anything surprise you? Like when you think of miracle, is this what you typically do, or you think more of it like magic? What do you think? Is this plausible to you? What do you think? Because many times people say, you Christians, you believe in miracles. That doesn't happen. It's God violating his laws, a miracle. Well, let me ask you, where in this is God violating any of his laws? He's just using wind. Really good wind. Imagine sleeping that night. Intense. Hope there was a wall there or something for them, right? So one thing it kind of brings out, the miraculous, many times, is done through the creation that he makes. That's a point to kind of think about. I mean, it makes me go back to the Eucharist. You see a miracle every time you go to the Eucharist, but does it look like a miracle at face value? No, it just looks like bread. Like, look at this type of miracle. It's through God's creative power, using what he already made to bring about that. So that's just kind of a point I think is kind of interesting. Okay. All right, so here's what happens from here, is that they go to Sinai. They go through Sinai. And what I would like to do is now look at the Ten Commandments. Let's see if you still believe in those. So go to chapter 20. And many times when you, chapter 20 is one of two places where the Ten Commandments is. Okay? The other set of the Ten Commandments is found in the book of Deuteronomy. Okay? But this is the one that we have. But let me ask you, is it the one that you learned in catechism or with the nuns? Let's see, okay? You ready? So what happens is Moses goes up the mountains and spends 40 days and 40 nights up on that without eating anything. Okay? And then he has a great theophany of God. God reveals his presence on the mountain, and then he gives these commandments. So let's look at it. So what you're seeing here is God first frees the people of Israel. He teaches them how to pray. Now God is teaching them how to live. Do you see the flow of the story there? God frees them from slavery so they might worship him, so they might live as God wants. That's actually the pattern of the book of Exodus. Okay? So if you notice, God's done all these good deeds. Now he tells you commandments. Right? Many times we think sometimes with faith is, they're always talking about rules. Like, Catholic Church always has rules. But if we follow the pedagogy of God, God frees, he asks for worship, and then he asks you to follow the commandments. That's kind of an interesting point there. All right, so let's look at the Ten Commandments, and then we'll see what you think. Here's a question to ask yourself. After reading this slowly, what is the most important commandment after reading these? Okay, what do you think? That's the question I'm asking you, and then you'll discuss. Then God delivered these commandments. And make sure you count them, okay? You ready? Okay. I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that place of slavery. You shall not have other gods besides me. You shall not carve idols for yourselves in the shape of anything in the sky above, or on the earth below, or on the waters beneath the earth. You shall not bow down before them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, inflicting punishment for their fathers' wickedness on the children of those who hate me, down to the 3rd and 4th generation, but bestowing mercy down to the 1,000th generation on the children of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave unpunished him who takes his name in vain. Remember to keep holy the Sabbath day. 6 days you may labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. No work may be done then either by you or your son or daughter, or your male and female slave, or your beast, or by the alien who lives with you. So that's an immigrant, a foreigner. In 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. But on the 7th day he rested. That is why the Lord has blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, that you may have a long life in the land which the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not kill, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male or female slave, nor his ox or ass, nor anything else that belongs to him. Okay, so those are the 10 Commandments. Looking at the way that's written, what do you think are the most important commandments there? 1, 2, 3, go. Kind of share with you at the table. Just by sheer number of words, what do you think? Okay, what do y'all think? Let's all come back. What do you think? What are the most, is this the typical way you read the 10 Commandments in a prayer book that's listed? It's not like this, is it? Right? So tell me, what do you think the emphasis of the 10 Commandments is? What's the most important commandment? You think? What's that? Loving God, loving Him, right? There's some loaded imagery there. What's one of the phrases there that's kind of makes people scratch their heads sometimes? For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Now, how does that strike you? He's a jealous God. What does that strike in you? Why are you so jealous? Take a chill pill. But what is that? It's a turn of phrase. What do you think that means? A jealous God is jealous. Yeah? But what the word jealousy, what does that evoke? If your spouse is jealous, or your boyfriend is jealous, or someone else is jealous, kind of angry, or kind of possessive? Yeah. So it's an adjective before God, so it must be good, right? Most of the time, John Smith is a jealous guy. Is that a compliment? But in this sense, you kind of see it's trying to use that language to get your attention. Okay? God wants you, and He only wants you. And He doesn't want you to love anyone else except Him. I mean, that focuses it for you, doesn't it? Right? Okay. All right, let's look at, I think the second most important one is the Sabbath. Do you notice that? I mean, look at that. How are we doing on that one in today's culture? I mean, let's look at that for a brief moment, right? So it says, 6 days you may labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. No work may be done then by either you, your son, or your daughter, or your male or female slave, or your beast. Gosh, the cattle can't even work. Or by the alien who lives with you. So think about that. I mean, why do you think there's this insistency on rest? God really is insisting that one day a week, and it's a particular day of the week, He wants you to rest. Why do you think that is? To honor Him? Well, I know a bunch of people that honor God and go to 10 o'clock Mass, but they're out in the fields in the afternoon. Is that faithful to the third commandment?
Continually talks about meditating on His Word, though, throughout the Bible.
Yeah.
So it would be a day that you should slow down, rest, and meditate upon His Word.
Okay, so meditating upon His Word. There's a good point there. Let me just ask you, do you think God knew what He was doing when He created us? Yeah? So He made us to rest. And that's one of the concerns of when we don't honor this, things start to come apart pretty quickly. Tell me how workaholics do over a long period of time. See, there's kind of this extreme. Either you work and never take a break, or you are always looking for a break. And what God is saying is, you need one day to completely rest. One day. In the normal course of life, you need one day to rest. Is it the end of the world? So that's why when you were in a Christian culture where there was encouragement, it was easy to honor this Sabbath. But the more the culture becomes secular, how are you going to honor the Lord with this? Do you really have to do that? I mean, at one level, you could have a question among yourselves and your family. Do you really have to do that today? Do you really? Let's play some cribbage. Let's play some euchre. Worship and then rest. That's why I jokingly say you should take a nap on Sunday. But what day are they referring to in this Ten Commandments? Saturday. The Sabbath was Saturday. So it went from sundown to sundown. So there are Orthodox Jews, you actually see it in Postville, Orthodox Jews who will not drive on the Sabbath. That's work. They're walking to synagogue on Saturday. So they can't take, there's no parking lot at that synagogue, I guess. Yep. So then you get to, well, is this an absolute rule? Later Jesus kind of talks about what's the purpose of it, God made man for the Sabbath. So that's later. God made it for us. It's a gift to us. So how does God feel when we don't receive that gift from Him? He gives it to us every Sunday. So anyway, when you look at all these commands, then when you get to all the other ones that everyone, let me tell you funny, I can say this when it comes to confession. Let me tell you, a lot more people focus on those one-liners than they do on the first three in a confession. But really, when you look at the Ten Commandments in the order of precedence, if you're living the first three, you won't be doing the next seven. You see? If you're truly giving your mind and your heart to God, you won't have any time to kill anybody. You won't want to, or be unfaithful to your spouse, or take or covet. You see? So one thing that's really beautiful about this part of the book of Exodus is what's really the order and the purpose behind the commandments, right? And he says, I make these commandments for you because this is how you can flourish. The commandments are for you to flourish and to be happy. They're not to be impositions. So if you think about one thing up to chapter 20 in Exodus, God hears the cry of the people. He frees them. He invites them to worship him. And then he gives them commandments. I think that's a point that we miss many times about the Bible, is that God gives us the rules, but first he saves us first. Does that make sense? So I think that's kind of powerful, I think. Okay, I want to get to Samuel. Okay, gosh, I could do maybe a whole year on Exodus. Okay, so here's the thing. The Ten Commandments are not the only laws in the book of Exodus. So if you go back to that phrase, if there would be one thing that I would ask you to write down in your handout, is to put this, is that God hears, then write an arrow. God saves, write an arrow. Here you go. Good catch. Then God invites to worship, arrow. And then God gives commandments. Okay? So then, these aren't the only commandments. If you go to chapter 21 and you go to 22, it gets to the laws that will make Israel a nation. In order for a country to work, you got to have laws. You just can't have anarchy. So if you go to 21 and you look at the subtitles, if you look at it, they're all dealing with how you should deal with people who damage your property, how you deal with your neighbor. So it's not just the Ten Commandments. It gets to a more specificity of what actually God wants to do. So let's kind of look at chapter 22. Look at chapter 22. Look at verse 6. It talks about loans and trusts. So let's kind of look at that. It kind of gives up some, because this is a big issue in our area. When a man gives money or an article to another for safekeeping, and it is stolen from the latter's house, the thief, if caught, must make twofold restitution. If the thief is not caught, the owner of the house shall be brought to God, to swear that he himself did not lay hands on his neighbor's property. In every question of dishonest appropriation, whether it be an ox or an ass or a sheep or a garment, or anything else that has disappeared, whether other claims that the thing is his, both parties shall present their case before God. The one to whom God convicts must make twofold restitution to the other. When a man gives an ass or an ox or a sheep or any other animal to another for safekeeping, if it dies or is maimed or snatched away without anyone witnessing the fact, the custodian shall swear by the Lord that he did not lay hands on his neighbor's property. The owner must accept the oath, and no restitution is to be made. But if the custodian is really guilty of theft, he must make restitution to the owner. If it has been killed by a wild beast, let him bring it as evidence, and he need not make restitution for the mangled animal. No, it's real thing with justice here. And here's where the second commandment comes in. You shall not use the name of the Lord your God in vain. Do you see what's the basis for the honesty of the person? They are swearing on God's name. So that's why they can have a law like that, because people are taking seriously the second commandment. If you swear by God, it's got to be true. So that's why if you don't have a belief in God, oaths really don't make any sense. Because you're putting your life on whether you're invoking God and whether you're telling the truth. And you tell the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. Yeah, help you God, you do. Because you're out of luck if you don't. So you see, that's an example of that. All right, I'm killing you with too many details here. Okay, the last thing I want to do is if you go to chapter, and then we'll end. If you go to chapter 25 through 32, what you start seeing there is God giving the instructions to Aaron for the proper worship of God. So from this point on, every time and everywhere that Israel will go, there'll always be a meeting tent. So let's say you're the people of Israel in the desert, okay? And I'm the meeting tent, okay? So the meeting tent would be set up away from the people of Israel, and they would set up, and the Levites and the priests would only take care of the meeting tent. And that's where you would go to pray to God. And all the stuff that's in that tent all have very particular details. And that's what 25 through 32 is all about. How tall should the Ark of the Covenant be? What's the materials should the Ark of the Covenant should be? All those type of things are brought up. Should there be a veil? How tall should be the tent? What should the priests wear? All those type of things. It's all that setting up of all of that. Does that make sense? So now you don't have to read it. Okay. But read it. It is kind of cool. If you're trying to fall asleep, it's a really good thing. Okay. Okay. So here's the thing. And this is the part where if you go to chapter 32, and this is the last thing we'll talk about with Exodus. Okay, if you go to 32, let's just read that first part. Now, if you look at the purple sheet, here's the question I want to ask you. How could the people of Israel abandon God so quickly after all they had seen? At the very bottom there. So let's look at this. When the people became aware of Moses' delay, so what happened is Moses went up the mountain a second time for 40 days and 40 nights. So when the people became aware of Moses' delay in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make us a god who will be our leader. As for the man Moses, who brought us out of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him." Aaron replied, "Have your wives and sons and daughters take off the gold earrings they are wearing and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron, who accepted their offering and fashioned this gold with a graving tool, made a molten calf. Then they cried out, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." On seeing this, Aaron built an altar before the calf and proclaimed, "Tomorrow is the feast of the Lord." Early the next day, the people offered holocausts and brought peace offerings. Then they sat down to eat and drink and rose up to revel. Well, that's going bad real quick, isn't it? Okay? With that, the Lord said to Moses, "Go down at once to your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt, for they have become depraved. They've soon turned aside from the way I pointed out to them, making for themselves a molten calf and worshiping it and sacrificing to it and crying out, 'This is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt.'" Why did Israel do that?
Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, why do you think Israel did that? Why? Why did they do that? Okay, let's all come back. What do you think? Why would Israel do that? What's going on there? Why? Why would they do that? What do you think? Are you befuddled?
We don't understand how after seeing all the labors happening.
Yeah. Well, now let's ask the question, to yourself. All that God has given you in your life, how can you be unfaithful to Him? That's really what's kind of getting at, If they could do it, we can do it. So what is the main sin of the Israelites? It goes back to connecting on chapter 20. What were the biggest commandments? You shall love the Lord your God and no other, and you shall not carve idols and make them your God. Right? That's the kiss of death. You know. So that's why we have to ask ourselves, what idols do we have? I have to tell you a funny story now, and I'll go to the book of Samuel. There's this priest I know. He's from Phoenix. His name is Father John Muir. He's another Father What a Waste. He should be a model or something. Handsome guy. Well, anyway, in seminary he was a musician. He'd write songs, and one of them that he would say is one of the names of his songs was inspired by the story, and it says, "You gotta kill your cow." That's the name of the song. You know, so he writes you have this thing, and you know it's a cow, you gotta kill it. You know, it's like, but really, what happens? You can't tolerate the cow, the idol. You actually have to destroy it. So let's just conclude by looking at that. So let me find it. Let's find this now. Oh, here it is. Go to verse 15 on chapter 32. Moses then turned and came down the mountain with the 2 tablets of the commandments in his hands. So you see, he's like, here's what you're supposed to be faithful to. That's one way of looking at it. Tablets that were written on both sides, front and back. Tablets that were made by God, having inscriptions on them that were engraved by God himself. Now when Joshua heard the noise of the people shouting, he said to Moses, that sounds like a battle in the camp. But Moses answered, it does not sound like cries of victory, nor does it sound like cries of defeat. The sounds that I hear are cries of revelry. As he drew near the camp, he saw the calf and the dancing. With that, Moses' wrath flared up, so that he threw the tablets down and broke them on the base of the mountain. Taking the calf they had made, he fused it in the fire and then ground it down to powder, which he scattered on the water and made the Israelites drink. That's worse than getting soap in your mouth. So what is that trying to teach the Israelites? If you can drink it, it's not God, in a way. This is just powdered up stuff, and it's in water, and you're going to drink it. You know. Sometimes punishment has to be severe to get your attention, right? So, I could go on more and more with Exodus. Okay, so we went over the second part of Exodus now. So let's just review one more time. God heard the cry of the people. He freed them. He leads them to worship. Then he leads them to the commandments. And then he wants to give them a life of order as a nation. So it's the birth of Israel. What you see at the end there is the birth of Israel. It's a young country. All right, how about before we go to Samuel, share with one another what's one thing that kind of struck you about the book of Exodus that you didn't know before. 1, 2, 3, go. Kind of think about it. What's maybe just one thing on the top of your head? Okay. Any last word on the book of Exodus? Any last word you want to share with everybody? Any last word?
I had a question.
Sure.
You had mentioned that he went up twice. to the
Yeah,
mountain.
yeah.
So, was the second time that he got the commandments?
First time it was.
It was the first time. Okay, so then
look at it one more time. I'm going so quick. Yeah, so there's the ratification of the covenant. Yeah, Moses is up there twice. Because if you go to chapter 24, that's where you see the people of Israel actually ratify the covenant. They ratify it through the blood. So if you quickly go to chapter 24, just to describe it, to give you the cliff notes, God takes 12 stones that represent the 12 tribes of Israel. He asks 5 strong men to sacrifice 5 oxen. They collect the blood. They keep half of it and they sprinkle it on the altar. And then Moses takes the other half and sprinkles it on the people. This is the blood of the covenant which you have ratified with the Lord. So right there, the people know that they're supposed to live this. They've said yes to it. So, any other questions or thoughts? Last words on Exodus. Does it help? Do you have a little better understanding of it? Does that help? Okay. It's a good book. It's not scary. Okay. Or you can maybe take some of those laws on fraud and loans, and you can maybe take it to your banker or something. Okay. All right, now why don't you get the white sheet out, and we're just going to begin now another section of the Bible. So what I'm doing is I'm skipping the rest of the Torah, the Pentateuch. So Leviticus is about the priests. And then after Leviticus is the book of Numbers, how Israel was ordered. Then after that is the book of Deuteronomy. Like I said, the book of Deuteronomy is the last speech of Moses. That's his last speech. That's basically what the book of Deuteronomy is. So if you want to know what the last words of Moses were, open up the book of Deuteronomy. Okay? Then after that is the book of Joshua. And then that's the story of Israel going into the promised land. The famous story of that is the battle at Jericho. How the people of Israel went around the city of Jericho 7 times. And then they all shouted, and the walls came down. Without a shot, they took over Jericho. Okay? Then it's the book of Judges. So this brings up a point that can lead us into Samuel. So here's the one thing that made Israel unique among all the ancient world. They did not have a king. There were no kings in Israel. No kings. You know? God was their king. So from time to time, judges would come up and would help Israel when they'd be in a problem. So that's one thing that's different. Israel was the only country in the Middle East that did not have a king. But then they got a little antsy, the people of Israel. So if you want to go to 1 Samuel, it's part of the historical books. And if you want to take out the sheet, this is what we're going to try to do with the historical books, the books of Samuel. So let's just look at the objective there. Okay. So it's right after the book of Ruth. Okay. So here are the objectives we'll try to do when we see Samuel. Number 1, I'm going to try to introduce 1 and 2 Samuel as the transition from the judges to kingship. To understand priest, prophet, and king in Old Testament times. Okay. To understand the hinge aspect of the prophet Samuel. He's a hinge. Think of a hinge on the door. He's a hinge within the scriptures. He's like a bridge. John the Baptist is another example of that. He's the bridge between the Old and the New Testament. Samuel is the bridge between the judges and the kings. Does that make sense? Then to understand David as a Messiah figure in the Bible. You know, they call Jesus the son of David. Why do they call him the son of David? There's a lot in the book of Samuel that tells us why. And then to continue this understanding of the pattern of God's relationship with Israel. So there are times that people were like so faithful, and God would be like, I love you. And then they'd be like, they'd go off the rails and violate all the things, and God would say, I love you. You know, that's kind of the way it was with God and the renewal of those covenants. Okay. All right. So I just want to do a little bit of a thing that'll help us with this. We have to have a review that when you hold the Bible in your hand, it's not just one book. There are many different forms of writing within the Bible. And we're going to be looking at a particular type, and that's historical narratives. But if you look at the Bible, there's at least 8 different types of writing in the Bible. So there's myth, like the book of Genesis. That's a form of myth. We believe that Adam and Eve existed, but was it exactly like that? You know, there's the use of myth. There's history in the Bible. There's poetry in the Bible. The greatest example of that is the Psalms. Okay. There's laws in the Bible. We just were looking at those, right? There's wisdoms and proverbs in the Bible. One of them is called the Book of Proverbs. Okay. There's prophecy in the Bible. And then there's apocalyptic literature, which specifically there are 2, the prophet Daniel, a little bit of the prophet Zechariah, and then the book of Revelation are the 3 examples of that. We'll get to that later down the road. And then lastly, we got letters. Okay? So here is what I want to do, is I just want to start the book of Samuel, the first book of Samuel, and chapters 1 to 3 is about the birth of Samuel and the call of Samuel. And guess what? You know these stories really well. You know the story. Do you know the story of Hannah off the top of your head? Do you know it? How many people know the story of Hannah off the top of their head without seeing it? A little bit? Okay. All right. Let's look at that one. It's awesome. So if you go to the first book of Samuel, everybody there? Okay, good. I'm so happy that you're there. Okay, here it kind of sets up the story of the 2 last judges. The 2 last judges in the history of Israel is Eli the priest. So it's kind of funny. A judge can be a priest too. You see these words: judge, priest, prophet, king. They're using all these words. What does all that mean? So you got to sort through that. Okay, so here's the story. There's a guy by the name of Elkanah. Okay? And he had a family. Okay? And he had 2 wives. One named Hannah and the other Peninnah. And here's the kicker. Peninnah was the one who was able to have children. Okay? She had a bunch of children. Okay? But the thing about Elkanah is that he was a devout man. And during that time, the place to go to worship God was not Jerusalem. It was Shiloh. Not the Battle of Shiloh from Civil War. The Battle of Shiloh from the Civil War was named after this Shiloh. Okay? That became a holy place. I'll bring a map next time. We'll find out where that is. So they would go to the temple, the meeting tent, where the Ark of God was. And that's where you would make your pilgrimage. And Eli had 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas. They were the priests that served the Lord. So that's the setup, okay? All right, what I want to do now, here we go. I love this. Okay, here we go. Go to verse 4. When the day came for Elkanah to offer sacrifice, he used to give a portion each to his wife, Peninnah, and to all her sons and daughters, but a double portion to Hannah, because he loved her. The Lord had made her barren. Her rival, to upset her, turned her into a constant reproach to her, that the Lord had left her barren. This went on year after year. Each time they made their pilgrimage to the sanctuary of the Lord, Peninnah would approach her, and Hannah would weep and refuse to eat. Her husband Elkanah used to ask her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you refuse to eat? Why do you grieve? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? So what Hannah's dealing with there is the shame of being barren. So there was the idea within Israel, if you were unable to have children, you were cursed by God. That was the cultural belief back then. So even though Hannah is loved more by her husband, she feels cursed. Okay? Hannah rose after one such meal at Shiloh and presented herself before the Lord. At the time, Eli the priest was sitting on a chair near the doorpost of the Lord's temple. In her bitterness, she prayed to the Lord, weeping copiously. And she made a vow, promising, O Lord of hosts, if you look with pity on the misery of your handmaid, if you remember me and do not forget me, if you give your handmaid a male child, I will give him to the Lord. For as long as he lives, neither wine nor liquor shall he drink, and no razor shall ever touch his head. That's a reminder of another. Do you know another guy that happened like? Samson. You know another guy they describe that like? John the Baptist. Kind of interesting. That same phraseology is used for Samson and for John the Baptist. That's kind of interesting, huh? That's kind of interesting. All right. Verse 12. As she remained long at prayer before the Lord, Eli watched her mouth. For Hannah was praying silently, though her lips were moving. Her voice could not be heard. Eli, thinking her drunk, said to her, how long will you make a drunken show of yourself? Sober up from your wine. It isn't that, my lord, Hannah answered. I am an unhappy woman. I have had neither wine nor liquor. I was only pouring out my troubles to the Lord. Do not think your handmaid a ne'er-do-well. My prayer has been prompted by my deep sorrow and misery. Eli said, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. She replied, think kindly of your maidservant, and left. She went to her quarters, ate and drank with her husband, and no longer appeared downcast. Early the next morning, they worshiped before the Lord, and then returned to their home in Ramah. Okay. What do you think of Hannah? What catches your attention as you're reading her account of praying in the temple? What's your feelings about Eli? What's your feelings about Hannah? What kind of strikes you? 1, 2, 3, go.
How come you didn't have 2 wives?
We'll talk about that after your discussion. Yep, we'll talk about that. Good catch. Okay, what does everybody think? Anything that, after we hear everyone, we'll answer Carla's question, okay? What do you think of that story thus far? At least the episode of her in the temple, what do you think? At the sanctuary there.
Well, Eli was pretty quick to judge her for talking to herself.
Yeah.
Accused her of being drunk.
Yeah, she thought she was drunk. Yeah. So being drunk is kind of like praying, and praying is kind of like being... No, I'm joking. I mean, I guess a couple of thoughts that come to mind is what inspires me about Hannah's prayer is that she is brutally honest with God. And she is not going to hold anything back from what's going on in her heart. This leads me to a story. There was a man I knew. He has now since passed away. When I was at St. Mindred, he had a son. His son was best friends with my friend who's a priest. And we would once in a while go to a Notre Dame game in Notre Dame. And his wife died of cancer. And the year after, we went back and we saw him again. We asked him how he was doing. And he said, I'm doing okay. But let me tell you, I can only go to a Spanish Mass. Like, why can you only go to he's a Texan, you know. Why does you can? Yeah, he's like, at a Spanish Mass, you're allowed to go there and you can cry. If I go to an Anglo Mass, they're all in a stare at me. What's wrong with him? You know? There's something about this allowing for people to be themselves, especially when they're going through a difficult time with their prayer, that you bring that to God. All right, let's get to the question of Carla then, okay? Why is there bigamy, or at least polygamy going on here, okay? This brings up something very important that you're going to see in the Bible. Just because it's in the Bible does not mean that it's necessarily taught by God, okay? So we believe very quickly that after the fall, after Adam and Eve, after Cain and Abel, after all of that started to happen, there started to be practices that were not intended by God. But God tolerated them. So one of the things that began to become tolerated was polygamy within the Old Testament. But it was never taught for or really supported officially by God. There's really no word of it until later when Jesus comes again. What does Jesus say when he talks about marriage? He made them male and female, and he says that's why a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, not wives, right? But it's because of the hardness of your heart that you've been unable to accept this. So that's why that's present. So for example, Solomon, later, David's son, had one wife, was the wisest of all the kings of Israel, but he became corrupted and he ended up with, I think, 1,000 wives. But they don't give him a gold star for that. They say that's one of the signs of Solomon's corruption at the end of his life. So that's kind of that idea. So I hope that, does that kind of answer it? Or maybe it doesn't look like it. You can talk to me after if you want. Okay, so she prays to God. She asks for a child. What does she do, though, in asking for a child? To give him to God. What do you think? Wow. Let's keep going. When Elkanah had relations with his wife Hannah, the Lord remembered her. She conceived and at the end of her term bore a son whom she called Samuel, since she had asked the Lord for him. So that's another example of what actually the name means. Samuel means being asked for from the Lord. That's what it actually means. So that's what the word means. The next time her husband Elkanah was going up with the rest of his household to offer the customary sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vows, Hannah did not go, explaining to her husband, "Once the child is weaned, I will take him to appear before the Lord and to remain there forever. I will offer him as a perpetual Nazarite." Nazarite? Does that sound like a familiar word later in the Bible? Nazareth. Her husband Elkanah answered her, "Do what you think best. Wait until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord bring your resolve to fulfillment." And so she remained at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. Once he was weaned, she brought him up with her, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and presented him at the temple of the Lord in Shiloh. After the boy's father had sacrificed the young bull, Hannah, his mother, approached Eli and said, "Pardon, my lord, as you live, my lord, I am the woman who stood near you here, praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord granted my request. Now I, in turn, give him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he shall be dedicated to the Lord." She left him there, and as she worshiped the Lord, she said, and then that's the Song of Hannah, is chapter 2. So what do you think about that? She asked to have her shame be taken away. God takes the shame away, but then actually dedicates Samuel to God. So what do you think about that idea of giving your child to the service of God? How does that kind of strike you there? You know, have one being dedicated right away. Do you think Samuel had anything to say about this? "Mom, I want to be a police officer." No, you don't. You're going to be a prophet of the Lord, and you're going to like it, right? You kind of put it in those terms, but as you see this, how does the story kind of strike you? So, a barren wife asked for a child. In turn, she promised to bring him to the Lord and then dedicate him for his service. How does that strike your sensibilities? Right, 1, 2, 3, go. Kind of talk about it. And then we'll conclude. All right, let's all kind of wrap up here. So what's your impression of the story of Hannah? This is the mother of Samuel. The idea of receiving a child and then giving the child to God as consecrated for service. What do you think of that?
Pretty big sacrifice.
Big sacrifice. How much does that rub up against our culture? Is it like sandpaper, heavy grit sandpaper?
Sam had nothing, he had no say in it.
Had no say in it.
She was regained God for the gift, just because she prayed, that he was conceived.
One common thing about the great figures of the Bible and the Old Testament is many times they are children of barren women. Do you notice that? John the Baptist, Samuel, Gideon. Many of the great figures are from that. So what it's showing is that God can bring something new out of nothing. That's kind of the deeper meaning there. Another thing, which I think is a very practical lesson for all of us, are we truly open to what God might be calling our children to do? Or how set are we on wanting them to do what we want them to do? At one level, they are pure gift. Actually, if you have children, they're really not your own. They're really not yours. They are God's. And does God have a particular plan for that person? I think that's a hard pill for our culture to swallow right now. But there is the sense of it deeply within the Bible. It's in the Bible that certain people are called for certain things. And that's what their job was given to them the moment that they were born. They didn't need any figuring it out. They were given a task. And isn't that kind of liberating at one level? I knew when I was in third grade I was supposed to be a priest. I just fought it a little bit, There's kind of a freedom of like, oh yeah, I know I'm going to be a priest. I know God is calling me to be a priest. Isn't there some freedom? Or that moment like, yeah, I always knew I was going to get married someday. You kind of knew that, But what if God would say, I want you to do this particular task, and you're made for this particular task? Isn't that what's going to give you the greatest fulfillment if you fulfill that mission? That type of thought about vocation is just not even present anymore in people's minds many times, but it really should be. It's in the Bible. It's a very perennial thing about the Bible. Did Moses have any say of what he was going to be? Did Jesus have any say? Really, do you really have to have that much say? I don't know. Maybe you don't. Oh, go after your dreams. We say that to all our kids. Fulfill your dreams. Do whatever you want. Is that really what she'd be asking? Shouldn't we be asking our kids, do whatever God wants you to do? That's really, are you willing to accept that? I'll tell you one last story. When I announced to my parents I was going to be a priest, my mom was like, okay, I'm not surprised. And my dad said, don't get too religious. My dad said, Dad, I'm going to be a priest, But even the faithful Catholic prayed the rosary every day, went to Mass every Sunday. Even he had a problem. He had a problem. Can my son be a priest? It brings all that. But there's something about Hannah's freedom that I think is a lesson for us. So, all right, we just went through 3 chapters of, only 1 chapter of Samuel. So I hope, is this going a little bit better pace? Okay, one last thing. Share with your table what's one thing you learned tonight that you're going to take with you in the car, that you will remember when you get to the car. What's one thing you'll remember when you get to the car?